All right, this is Openstax U.S. History, Chapter 4, Rule Britannia, the English Empire 1660 to 1763. And what this chapter is doing is showing us some of the long-term causes of the American Revolution. So we're not quite at the American Revolution, but we're interested in looking at what was going on in the colonies in the 100 years or so leading up to the American Revolution, and how did that how did that brew in the colonies before this event took place. One point to make is that during this period and even leading up to the American Revolution, the colonists very much viewed themselves as being English, as British, as part of the empire. This picture here is a colonial family who, from just looking at it, you would guess that they were absolutely British, and that's because they would tell you the same, that they were certainly part of this British Empire. We're going to be looking at section 1, so 4-1, Charles II and the Restoration Colonies. Charles II is the English king. And in the 1660s, he was restored to the throne, and so we refer to this as the Restoration. When Charles II was restored to the throne, he established colonies. So these are the colonies created by Charles II. All right, so this is what this event refers to. So a little bit of backstory on Charles II. We have to go back and recall some of the information that we learned from previous chapters, and that was the English Civil War. Recall that when we think about English colonization of the New World, that we had the establishment of the Chesapeake colonies, that is Virginia and Maryland. We had the establishment of the New England colonies. But then colonization of the New World was put on pause, right? That there was a break there. And that was because the Civil War was raging in England. And so while the Civil War was going on in England, there was really no colonization of the New World because everything was being focused at home. After that Civil War was over in 1660, colonization resumed with the Restoration Colonies. So any colony that's established essentially after the English Civil War, we refer to them as Restoration Colonies, and they have, there's a couple of things they have in common. Just to recap, the English Civil War pit the English monarch Charles I, who is the father of Charles II, against Oliver Cromwell and Parliament. So this was a war that was king versus Parliament. You have a picture of Oliver Cromwell right here. And during that conflict, the English King Charles I was beheaded, and so therefore Parliament and Oliver Cromwell were victorious. The government they established, or the period in England where there was no king, because the king had been beheaded, is referred to as the English interregnum. So this is the transition, or not really a transition, but this is the period when there was no English king. Instead, Oliver Cromwell more or less ruled over England. This was a period that was really characterized by chaos. And so after about 20 years, what they decided, Parliament decided in England, was they wanted a king again. They were going to restore the king. They couldn't restore Charles I because he was dead, but who they could restore was Charles II, his son. And so they asked Charles II to come and be the English monarch. This event is known as the Restoration, right? So once Charles II, son of the dead king from the Civil War, is back on the English throne, he begins to establish restoration colonies, mostly to people who were loyal to him. So he wants to reward people who were loyal to him during this conflict. And so for that reason, most of the restoration colonies are proprietary colonies, meaning they are the property of people, right? Of the people who own them, most of them being loyal supporters of Charles II. So we're not going to talk about every single one of these colonies, but there are some important ones that we do want to kind of just break down and establish. The first ones are the Carolinas. So initially, Charles II gave a royal charter to 8 supporters to establish a Carolina colony, right? The idea was that there was going to be one colony. However, when that colony was created, you had two different population centers emerging, one in the north and one in the south. And even though these two sides sort of eventually grew apart, they formally split in 1729 to form what we call North and South Carolina. Of course, these are two states that we have till this day. They differed a little bit from each other in the north, primarily in terms of the economy. You had it a little bit more like Virginia. The people in North Carolina came from Virginia mostly. They grew tobacco in that particular part. In South Carolina, it was primarily rice that was grown, and it was immigrants from the West Indies, so places like Jamaica and Barbados, where English servants were being displaced by African slaves. And although you did have African slavery in both North and South Carolina, it was much more the case in South Carolina. And South Carolina in 1715 was one of the few areas where slaves outnumbered the free white population. And that was not the case really in any of the other colonies, including the Chesapeake, where you actually had the most slaves, but the demographics were as such in South Carolina. The capital of Carolina Colony was Charlestown, appropriately named after Charles II. You could see a map or a picture of the Carolina Colony here. This is a very early depiction, very early settlement of that colony. So, when we think about the Carolina Colony, it is mostly a cash crop producing colony that relies very heavily on African slavery. The relation between the Carolina Colony and the Native American population was more or less similar to what we have learned in the previous colonies. You had tribes like the Yamasee and the Creek. The Yamasee War in the early 1700s was another one of those colonial Native American conflicts that broke out. In this, you did have eventually a colonial victory. And like we saw, especially in these early years, a willingness by tribes to ally themselves with the English. In this case, the Cherokee and the English formed an alliance with one another to battle back and fight against the Yamasee. It was especially straining considering the land that was required to grow these cash crops. Just like in Virginia with Bacon's Rebellion, the pressure that the swarming English put on the indigenous and Native American population really strains those relations, and it's very common to see practically conflicts in every single one of the English colonies. So when we think about Carolina, money-making and cash crop producing, utilizing African slavery. Another set of restoration colonies that were created following the English Civil War was New York and New Jersey. Now recall that in New York, you had the colony of New Netherlands, specifically New Amsterdam, which was where modern-day New York City is located. The English took that over from the Dutch through a series of wars that the two engaged in. So when we think about New York, it's a transition from New Netherland to New York. A couple of characteristics about New Netherland and New Amsterdam that really translated over into the colony of New York is this idea of a diverse population. Remember, the Dutch were more or less religiously tolerant, and so you had a large number of different languages that were spoken there, a large number of differing and diverse religions. For example, a significant Jewish population lived there, and those people who had lived in New Amsterdam previously now found themselves in New York and under English occupation. The colony was given to, again, a loyal supporter of Charles II, James, the Duke of York, who more or less, because he was the proprietary owner, he owned the colony like you own any sort of property. He more or less ruled it like a king, which was not very unpopular. It was only by 1783 when the Charters of Liberty was established. This was to establish a democratic government in New York. that you had some semblance of representative government and democracy, and that helped keep some of the population there. In terms of the relationship between New York, New Jersey, and we're focusing mostly on New York here, but the relationship between New York and New Jersey, they made a peace settlement with the powerful 5 nations of the Iroquois, sometimes referred to as the Iroquois Confederacy, who were able to make alliances between the Mohawk, Oneida, and some other groups. And there was, even though relations were strained, you had the ability to form or create treaties, which could make or create time periods of peace. But again, like in other areas, as more and more people moved to the area, the stress that it put on resources like land, you could have conflicts break out in the area. It's worth noting that perhaps the Iroquois Confederacy was the most powerful Native American confederation, or really group, in North America, right? So certainly the English colonists in New York there wanted to avoid conflict with the Iroquois. And lastly, we're going to talk about the colony of Pennsylvania, which is unique and in some cases the most popular of the English colonies. The colony of Pennsylvania was created by William Penn, who was given the colony by the English king because the English king Charles II owed his father money. So we'll write that. And William Penn sought to create a religious colony for Quakers. Quakerism, or the Society of Friends, as it's called, is a religious group. They faced persecution in England, right? So we'd still consider them Protestant. So they're Christian, but they're not Catholic. So they're a Protestant denomination, but they have unique beliefs that created friction back home. And so William Penn wants to create, or does create, the colony of Pennsylvania in order for Quakers to move there and kind of live in peace and prosperity away from persecution. Some of their key and core tenets, and this helps us understand the way that Pennsylvania was created. The Quakers believe in this idea of an inner light, which is sort of like a soul in some sense. They believe in a spiritual equality. That is, everybody has an inner light inside of them, and all you have to do is kind of cultivate it and bring it out. But that inner light, or kind of like soul, is essentially in everyone, right? In everyone. And this translates into the Quakers practicing sort of a very radical form of social equality. That is to ignore the social pyramid. Right? We got to recall that in England, this is a time period of kings and lords and nobles and barons, and there's a certain order to society, especially based off of bloodlines. The Quakers, they don't abide by those rules, right? They refuse to acknowledge somebody as a lord or a king, and for that reason, they get persecuted in England, and that's kind of one of the reasons why they wanted to come to Pennsylvania. Unlike some of the other religious colonies that we had talked about, like the Massachusetts Bay Colony, there's no official state church, and that Pennsylvania, there is a certain semblance of religious tolerance there. So they are tolerant of pretty much other religious denominations, and that's different, right? Different than the Puritans, which have a very close relationship between church and state. They're more or less the same thing. One of the core belief systems for the Puritans is pacifism. That is the refusal to use violence. And because of that, because the pacifists don't, or because Quakers don't resort to violence and won't use violence, it means that out of all the English colonies, that Pennsylvania has the friendliest relationship with Native Americans. They are one of the rare colonies of the English colonies that don't have any early conflicts. This does get complicated when immigrants move to the colony, specifically from Germany, Ireland, and Scotland. right? Even though Quakers are not willing to use violence, a lot of the immigrants and other religious groups and other national groups that come in are willing to use violence. So it's not as if there were no wars in Pennsylvania, just very early on, there were not any conflicts. This idea of social equality and the inner light also translates to the Quakers' view on slavery. They're one of the earliest anti-slavery groups. They're still a religious group, but they're uncomfortable with it. And by about the time of the American Revolution, the Quakers actually make it sort of a banishable offense if you hold slaves. They're not quite yet there at that point, but if you understand their views about inner light, about spiritual equality, about social equality, you can understand why many Quakers were uncomfortable with slavery. And they're one of the earliest organizations to kind of voice their opinions on an anti-slavery position. Because of the way that Pennsylvania was set up with a moderate climate, a religiously tolerant society, because it was one of the more popular colonies, Philadelphia, by the time of the American Revolution, we could call Philadelphia more or less the capital of the New England colonies. Even though there isn't officially one, it surpasses Boston in terms of its population. And a lot of people from within the colonies moved there. And Benjamin Franklin is a great example. He was born a Puritan in Boston, and he made his way to Philadelphia and practiced more or less a deist view. And that is the view that God exists but doesn't play an active role in the world. So Benjamin Franklin is a great example of how the Pennsylvania colony and Philadelphia specifically grew in terms of population leading up to the American Revolution. So that pretty much runs down or gives you an idea of what those restoration colonies were. Again, Carolina, New York, and Pennsylvania, how they differed a little bit from one another. Now, a very important point here at the very end of chapter 4, section 1, and that is the Navigation Acts. And we're going to go ahead and use green here because this has to do with the economy and specifically a long-term cause of the American Revolution right here. So in order to understand the Navigation Acts, we have to come back to this idea of mercantilism, which we summarized previously in a previous chapter. So I'm not going to go into great detail here, but mercantilism was an economic theory. It stated that colonies only trade with the mother country, right? And you don't import, right? Specifically, don't import, buy stuff from other goods. The Navigation Acts are mercantilism put into practice, right? And what they're designed to do is to restrict trade. In other words, what the Navigation Acts do is that it makes it illegal for the colonies to trade with other countries, right? So we're right, makes illegal trade with other nations, right? Makes it illegal to trade with other nations. And this is a problem because if you're a merchant or a business person in the colonies, you want to trade with whoever gives you the most money. In some cases, that's England. In other cases, that's not. So what happened was that there was, a lot of smuggling that occurred. Smuggling is illegal trade. That is, colonists still traded with other nations like France specifically. And one of the big trades that occurred was that people in New England bought French sugar and then put it or transformed it into rum. And that was a major source of revenue for the New England colonies, which really struggled to make money. Recall that in New England, those colonies were established mostly for religious reasons. So the struggle to make money was certainly felt. And so buying sugar from France, which was cheaper, turning it into rum, and then selling it was a way to make money. This was illegal under the Navigation Acts, but the New England colonists did it anyways. It was also part of the Navigation Acts to establish what were vice admiralty courts. These were courts with no jury. And so if you were caught smuggling, you could be brought up before a vice admiralty court. And without what the colonists appeared to be a fair trial, you could be found guilty. All the custom agents needed was a writs of assistance. This was the right to inspect a colonial ship. Right to inspect a colonial ship. And you could see how this started to build up tension between the colonists and the British Empire. If you're a colonist and you're illegally trading, you get caught by a customs agent using a writs of assistance who has the right to, or boards your ship. You're brought before a court where you have no jury, and you're found guilty. So this started to build up a lot of tension. Now, here's the kicker, is that even though these laws were on the books, and they were on the books roughly from the 1650s, right? We have to think 1650 to 1776, because that's when independence is declared. So for 100 years, over 100 years, the British were essentially restricting where the colonists could and could not trade. However, for the most part, they did not enforce the law. And salutary neglect is the approach Britain took. That is, no enforcement of the law, right? No enforcement of the law. And that becomes a problem because when the 1770s roll around, the British are going to start enforcing this law, and that creates a lot more problems, which lead to the immediate outbreak of the American Revolutionary War.